Welcome to the program. I'm Andrew Wilkow. We are 33 days until the layoff bomb drops. And it is dogma. It is the dogma of left-wing economists and politicians to use regulation, the tax base, or worse, the printing press as a way to support the means component of demand for a product or service. Again, this is better known as demand-side economics, and it is the dogma of left-wing socialists. And they believe in it like cultists. To quote Winston Churchill, socialism is inseparably interwoven with totalitarianism and the abject worship of the state. The government's support of demand sounds so good on paper. It's sold on good intentions. And for a time, it produces a beautiful economic intoxication. And then without fail, the economic hangover, or worse, alcohol poisoning. The latest victim of big government's attempt to create a utopia is almost 11 million people are now buried underwater in mortgages. That's 1/5 of all U.S. homeowners. This quote appeared on Bloomberg under the headline, FHA needs bailout from Treasury to plug budget, Bacchus says. And I quote, the Federal Housing Administration will need billions of dollars in aid from the U.S. Treasury before the end of the year to fill a financial hole caused by defaults on mortgages it insures. House Financial Services Chairman Spencer Backus went on to say, quote, because of the number of foreclosures, they've actually indicated they will have to come to the American people and ask for money. Let's not forget what Miss Stimulus Package herself, Christina Roma, recently said, and I quote, the new evidence on the importance of household debt has convinced me that we're likely going to need to help homeowners who are underwater. When the federal government started getting involved in the housing market, that's when the problem started. It's yet another example of demand-side economics. Now, the last time I checked, home ownership was something to be achieved by an individual, not a civil right. I repeat, not a civil right. Now, unless, of course, you're a progressive. And we always get the typical response from Democrats when pointing out the failure of demand-side economics. In this case, they'll say, what do you want? Everyone to be homeless? Right. It's always two choices, central planning versus nihilism. Either the federal government buys everybody a home or we're all out in the cold. Gee, how on earth did anyone find shelter before the FHA? Here is the perfectly executed political analysis. Government is the poison in the organic economy. The laws of supply and demand are like gravity. I'm going to use some arbitrary numbers here. If on any day there are 1 million homes for sale across the United States and only 750,000 people who qualify to buy a home, then it's a buyer's market. Price is stabilized by the fact that homeowners compete for the buyers with price. New construction, stabilized by the same force. When the government uses banking regulation and the tax base to provide more people the means to buy a home, the number of buyers will eventually outgrow the number of sellers, thus flipping the market to a seller's market and artificially inflating home prices. Then what happens is that those who legitimately qualified for a home must now compete with those who have been subsidized. And they must now pay more to get what was once in their normal price range. As the price inflates, the mortgages, well, they get bigger and riskier for the buyer, the lender, and unfortunately, now the government. One effect is that homeowners get the false sense of value of their homes. And in many cases, back in the 90s, homeowners were encouraged to borrow against the value of their home and buy large-ticket consumer goods, which gave the impression of a growing economy. Many people blew through their savings, thinking, well, the sale of the home, it would replace the nest egg. This also led to the belief that the government was getting more revenue. They called it the Clinton surplus. Another effect was the artificial boom in the construction trades and materials production. All of this was built on the weakest of foundations, government market intervention. The bubble inflated and it burst, creating millions of innocent victims. The cycle that I'm talking about took about 13 years to go from boom to bust. Now, take a look at this graph. It's from an article by David Hochberg of Investors Business Daily. Up until the 1990s, the percentage of people who actually owned a home didn't go above 66%. Then the government started meddling with the market before the GOP took over Congress under President Clinton. Progressive Barney Frank began setting the wheels in motion. He was advocating for affordable housing for all. Now it sounds noble. Back to the Investors Business Daily graph. Hochberg walks us through the government's intervention. 1992, the Housing Committee Development Act is passed. Basically, what that did was let the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, force Fannie and Freddie to buy up loans. 1995, HUD adopts affordable housing mandates for Fannie and Freddie. 96, Fannie and Freddie are mandated to make 40% of new loans to low-income borrowers. 1998, Bill Clinton actually brags about how much money is being lent to people who can't afford homes.
The Community Reinvestment Act was set up to say to the bank regulators, look, you guys go in and look at these banks and tell them you got to take some of your money and invest it in inner cities, in neighborhoods, and with people who otherwise would not get it, so they have a chance to build homes, to build businesses, to create jobs, to build neighborhoods. In the 20-year history of the Community Reinvestment Act, 85% plus of the money loaned out under it to poor inner city neighborhoods has been loaned in the 5 years since I've been president.
The year 2000, the percentage goes up to 50% of new loans available. 2003, George W. Bush. The American Dream Down Payment Act helps subsidize down payments for low-income borrowers. Ben Bernanke recently gave a speech entitled Challenges in Housing and Mortgage Markets. He actually suggested that lending standards are still too tight. Yeah, I know, you could challenge my academic pedigree. I don't have a master's or a doctorate. I'm not a professional economist. But wouldn't that mean that the tighter standards would have fewer defaults? Then consider this. That default rate of FHA loans is almost 10% now, which is up from last year. So now Bernanke, and I'm going to have to disagree with you on this one, lending standards are actually way too lax. What other evidence do you need? None of this intervention into home prices was prompted by millions of people being homeless. But like the creation of Social Security, the government decided to try and create a desired outcome. Now, conservatives do not get a free pass here. Social conservatives believe that easy home ownership would encourage people to go out and get married and start nuclear families. It doesn't matter why this was supported, it failed. Here's another problem. Demand-side progressives think the answer is always another program. It's always another intervention. So here we go again. Obamacare and the student loan industry. The really frightening thing is when the Obamacare bubble bursts, this time intervention will cost real lives. I can't go to break without just giving you a simple analogy here. There's a reason why there's a sign in parks and in recreation areas and forests that says, don't feed the animals, don't feed the birds. What do you think happens if you start to feed the birds? You get more birds. Do you know what more birds means? It means you need more food. More food brings more birds. More birds requires more food. What happens when the food goes away? You've got a whole lot of birds and not a lot of food. Some of those birds die. That's reality. Again, the only poison in an organic economy is the government. Next, more on why demand-side economics is killing this country. We're right, they're wrong. More Wilkow after the break. Welcome back to Wilkow. You know, the set is all set up for holiday cheer and holiday joy, and I'm bumming you people out with all this dismal economic stuff. But the truth is, once government gets its hooks into an industry like housing or healthcare, it's impossible to rip them out. When government is driving the demand, the welfare state will just continue to expand. Now, I want to bring in Mark Calabria. He's the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute and a former Deputy Assistant for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And Peter Schiff is the founder of Euro-Pacific Capital. I think I'm going to start with Peter on this one because I have to imagine I offended every single one of your sensibilities with my monologue on the government poisoning the organic laws of supply and demand.
Well, no, you didn't offend me at all. Everything that you said was correct. And, this whole Keynesian fixation on demand is backwards. They've got economics upside down. The demand is already there. The key to an economy is to produce the supply necessary to satisfy it. In America, we have a $500 billion a year trade deficit. That proves that we're not producing enough, and what we need to do is spend a lot less so we can save more and finance the capital investment necessary to produce that output. But unfortunately, the government keeps artificially stimulating consumption through artificially low interest rates and a tax code that encourages this, and that is the real problem that we face. We have borrowed and spent ourselves into bankruptcy.
Mark, the difference between supply-side economics and demand-side economics is supply-side economics doesn't cost the government or the taxpayer a penny. The truth about demand is its desire for a product or service plus the means to acquire it, and those means should come from one's labor. When the government tries to mess with that, they throw off the whole pricing system.
Absolutely, and I think if we've learned anything from this crisis is when you get prices wrong, you're going to get a lot else in the system wrong. And of course, part of this is to make people feel momentarily rich by running up asset prices. Ultimately, as Peter mentioned, you've got to have investment, and we had this attitude that housing was investment rather than what it really is consumption, and somehow running up housing prices will make people feel richer on that they'll spend, and somehow you get this virtuous cycle, and of course it's not the way it works. You end up overbuilding something of too much that you don't want, and then you have to have a transition to what you do want. And so I do think it's fair to say that the Keynesian vision is just trying to build a government bridge from the last bubble to the next bubble, rather than letting our economy grow based on the fundamentals of investment that, and again, my friends on the left should actually really listen to this, because ultimately, if you want to grow wages, you have to invest in capital because that increases productivity, and that's what grows incomes, that's what grows the middle class, not running up housing prices.
Yeah, Peter, I referred to the people that lost everything in this bubble as innocent victims. I mean, they took the signals from government. As a financial guy, yet you had to see this coming. A lot of people saw this coming. People were going out and buying big-ticket items. They were spending through their nest eggs. They were spending on all kinds of things that they probably wouldn't have spent their money on if they knew that their home prices weren't going to stay in an elevated value. And then all of a sudden you had this investment in mortgage-backed securities.
Yeah, I was warning about this crisis for years. I never got into more arguments at dinner tables, at parties, than I did about the housing bubble in 03, 04, 05, 06. But the problem was people were behaving in a rational manner based on all the mistakes the government made. The government was basically giving a lot of people the opportunity to gamble with somebody else's money. A lot of people who ended up walking away from their houses made a lot of money. They refinanced 2, 3, 4 times. They used that money to take vacations, to buy cars, to buy plasma TVs, and then when the bottom dropped out, they walked away. It didn't matter. They made a fortune because the government let people go into a casino with taxpayers' money. None of this would have happened if we had a free market. We talk about getting prices right. The price that we really have wrong today is interest rates. We don't let the market determine interest rates. We let the Federal Reserve pick interest rates, just like the Soviet Union used to set the price of bread. Interest rates are too low, and it's screwing up the economy. Because rates are too low, we borrow too much, we consume too much, we don't save enough, we don't invest enough, and we have these bubbles that are all about credit and interest rates being too low. If we let interest rates go up, we would solve these problems, but unfortunately, to solve the problems, it's going to require some bitter-tasting medicine, because when we let interest rates go up, then housing prices are going to come down, and the government is going to be forced to dramatically cut spending and or default on its debts.
You know what's the worst part about this, Mark, is if all three of us could hop in Marty McFly's DeLorean and go back a decade and say to people, listen, you're running off to buy these big-ticket items, you're making these home improvements, you're buying a second home, taking a vacation, buying your daughter this insanely overpriced wedding, all because you think there's value in your home. Let me tell you what's going to happen a few years from now. Nobody would have believed you.
They would.
No,
they
I
would
did
know.
tell them that. If you go back and look at my mortgage banker speech on YouTube from 2006 in front of 3,000 mortgage bankers, even if I had that DeLorean, I couldn't have said anything different. I laid it out exactly the way it was going to happen, and nobody still believed me.
Mark?
And Peter makes an important point there, and I did the same. 2003, 2004, I worked on Senate Banking Committee. We were saying Fannie and Freddie were going to blow up and be very expensive and cost us, and all we ever heard was, housing prices never go down, GSEs don't fail, and of course all that turned out to be terribly wrong. I really do want to echo something that Peter said that I think is incredibly important. People made rational decisions. This wasn't craziness. Government came in and set up really bad incentives for banks, bad incentives for homeowners. I mean, take a look at the banks. Look at Bear Stearns. They funded themselves 30-year assets overnight paper. Why would you ever have to fund 30-year assets with 24-hour paper? Well, if the Federal Reserve engineers an incredibly steep yield curve, then you're going to do something stupid like that. So again, and it's the same thing with homeowners choosing adjustable rate mortgages. I think the numbers I've seen are something like 60% of subprime loans that went into default were at some point before cash out refis. And so again, we've painted this world where somehow you put no money down, you take tens of thousands of dollars out, buy a plasma TV, go on vacation, walk away, and suddenly you're the victim. Well, you are the victim. You're the victim of bad government incentives. And so ultimately, as Peter has mentioned, we have to have interest rates get back to normal. Now, that absolutely means that the distortions that we have built into the economy because of the current interest rates will be painful when they unwind, but it's better to unwind them sooner because the longer they're this way, the more painful it would be. And we can't you can't fight the fundamentals forever with cheap credit.
I'm going to make everyone feel old when I say this. Remember that phrase, compassionate conservatism? That doesn't feel like it's that long ago, but let's be honest, social conservatives thought this was the key to building nuclear families. They thought the only thing that might have been holding people back from getting married and having children and doing all those American family things was the ability to buy a home, and social conservatives got right on board with this. I am not giving Bush and I am not giving social conservatives a free pass on this one, Mark. You must have seen this at HUD.
I was absolutely the case.
All right, well, first Mark, then Peter.
I would say absolutely the case. One of the things that was really a big problem was that the Bush HUD was the ones who raised the housing goals the last time, and they raised them higher than the Clinton people raised them for the Freddie and Fannie. As you mentioned, in your monologue opening, the American Dream Down Payment Act that was written by George Bush's people, you actually had, and I take great pride in this, and that the HUD people under Bush came to Congress and said, why don't you let us make FHA loans for zero down payment? And my response when they told me that was, are you crazy? And of course, we killed that before that, but they got every other bad ideal. So again, Bush people were behind this. And I'll also say from the time we spent trying to fix Freddie and Fannie, we fought a lot of Republicans trying to keep them on board. I won't name names at this point. But it wasn't just the Democrats. It wasn't just Barney Frank. It wasn't just Chris Dodd or Paul Sarbanes. There were a lot of Republicans that were deep in Fannie and Freddie's pocket, and they were just as bad as Democrats were. So this is a bipartisan mess, and I think there's a lot of blame worth going around.
All right, I'll wrap with you, Peter. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I never liked that compassionate conservative phrase when Bush coined it, because it really is kind of an admission that you believe that that conservatism lacks compassion, when that's not the truth. That's always what the left wants to say, but it's the liberals that lack reason or lack intelligence. The most compassionate market is a free market. Unfettered capitalism is the best way to raise the living standards of everybody. And when you try to substitute emotion for logic, and you try to legislate based on what you think sounds good, you end up with these unintended consequences that end up backfiring, and all these well-meaning, well-intentioned programs have paved the road really to hell and have backfired, and all the people that the government tries to help with their compassion are the ones that end up getting hurt the most.
All right, Mark, Peter, thank you so much for being here and hashing this out with me. Now, liberals are longing for the tax rates of the 1950s. Should I try to shake my pelvis? If only things were that simple. I'll explain next.